Concerns always lingered for her because I rarely delved into the depth of how her affair impacted and changed me with anyone other than her. I believe she fears that I might harbor some repressed hatred for her, but I don't. It's akin to touching a hot stove. Do it once and you never purposely do it again. That's how I am about my emotions. I'm not devoid of them, but I choose to keep some safeguarded within myself. I had a conversation with my wife, whom we'll call Jenny. She was fine with it, and even encouraged me to include more details than intended. Her reasoning was that everyone needed the complete picture to understand why she ardently pursued reconciliation with me, why it worked for us, and to grasp why I resisted, and how I now perceive our love and marriage differently. After the initial draft, I read it, and felt an uneasy feeling about how my wife appeared in the story, and subsequently in our marriage. While she had no issue with the written story, I decided to include this up front. My wife has evolved into an incredible spouse, mother, and woman. She holds a professional degree in her career, and is well regarded and admired in her field. She suffered significantly, admittedly due to her actions, and, to no lesser degree, from me. During reconciliation, she truly underwent a transformative process and emerged as strong as steel. Her betrayal was devastating, but in my case, it was the circumstances surrounding the affair that ultimately allowed me to forgive her, not excuse her, but forgive her. I lost a part of the good in me through this pain. In contrast, she emerged from it as a better person. At times I resent that, but then I see the positivity she has brought to my life over the 23 years since this happened, and it's okay. I'm presenting this chronologically. Obviously, I wasn't aware of some events until later. The details come from writings my wife did for therapeutic reasons, something she also incorporated into our reconciliation process. We still have the notebooks, planning to burn them on our 50th wedding anniversary. We married at 20. About a year later, I decided to go back to school part-time to finish my degree. Eventually, we had a child, and I felt the pressure to complete my degree. My son had just turned 2 when I started my last year of college. 2 semesters were all I needed. In September of 1993, my schedule included a part-time job from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. as a store stalker, a full-time administrative job at the police department from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Tuesday night classes from 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., and Saturday classes from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. My wife worked as a nurse's aide at a local hospital from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. My mother cared for our son, and both our jobs, as well as my parents' home, were within a 10-minute drive from one another. It was the best setup possible for what I was trying to accomplish. The weekend before today, we were in constant arguments. It was spring of 1994, finals week for me. If I completed my papers and passed my finals by the following Sunday, we would be celebrating my completion of a bachelor's in science and finally ending this 8-month schedule. I was working, but she was upset because I wouldn't take time off from studying to take her and our son somewhere. She had been complaining about my work and school for some time, and it had gotten so bad that we had stopped being closeness 2 months prior. On this specific Monday evening, I was verifying a research paper I had finished on Saturday, which was due Tuesday evening, and she consistently engaged in arguments. Finally, I instructed her to be quiet and stop behaving like a child. She stared at me and boldly declared, "I hate you, and I am in love with someone else." Just like that, I was stunned. We argued for about an hour until she confessed about an incident earlier that day during lunch at work. For the past 2 months, she had been involved in an emotional affair with a janitor at the hospital. Essentially, it began with him complimenting her and consistently appearing every time she turned around. This progressed to lunch together in the cafeteria and regular sessions of complaining about me to him. About 2 weeks prior, their wine sessions shifted to the car. She later admitted to kissing him twice during that time, but today it escalated into a full makeout session, concluding with romantic activities and a declaration of their love for each other. Upon hearing this, I essentially disconnected from the conscious world, dissociating from all reality. I may delve into further details regarding my thought process that night later. In the meantime, this is what my wife wrote about that moment. It was strange when I informed him of what we had done. I was fully prepared for some type of outburst. However, he just looked at me with the most horrible pain imaginable. Then it transformed into something indescribable, blankness. He turned around and walked to the bedroom, quietly closing the door. I remember getting angry. He wouldn't even fight for me. Brad. At that moment, I felt I had made the right decision and everything was going to work out. I did it. I was breaking free from the man who had been ignoring me for all these months. Returning to the living room with a suitcase, I walked past her and out the front door. I recall her repeatedly asking where I thought I was going, accusing me of running home to Mommy. Placing the suitcase in the driveway, I went back in, grabbed her purse, held it out, and instructed her to leave. This shocked her. She refused. I gently carried her over my shoulder, walked out the door, and sat her on the car hood. Her shock allowed me time to re-enter the house, lock the door, and prevent her attempts to get in. Eventually, she left to stay with her parents, informing them of our separation without disclosing the reason. It was a long night. I informed both jobs of a family emergency, slept at some point, and woke up at 7, immediately planning how to minimize contact with my wife. I called my mother to watch over my son, made a to-do list, dropped my son off, and explained to my mother that we would talk later that day. I then went to the office of a lawyer friend of my family. He had gone to school with my dad, and I knew him all my life. I expressed my desire to initiate divorce proceedings promptly. He attentively listened to my narrative and suggested taking some time to think, but I remained firm. He mentioned he could finalize the divorce papers by the day's end. I informed him I would retrieve them that day and personally file them with the clerk's office. Handling such matters was part of my responsibilities at my department job. Subsequently, I obtained new locks for the house and made a visit to the bank. I closed both our savings and checking accounts, placing half the funds in an envelope. I visited my sister-in-law at her workplace, delivering my wife's share of the money, instructing her to convey that my wife should not contact me, and this represented her portion from the bank. Additionally, I informed her about canceling our sole credit card at my mom's place. I divulged all details, and my sister and little sister devised a plan for the latter to stay at my house, caring for my son, while I juggled work and school for the remainder of the week. Returning home, I changed the locks, spent the afternoon cleaning and bonding with my son, then proceeded to school. My wife chose not to go to work that day, reaching out to the janitor to share the events. He showed sympathy and invited her to his house that evening to escape the stress. More details about this house will be shared later. In short, she went, and they were closeness. Here is her account of that night. He drifted into sleep afterward. Initially, I felt so thrilled, but as it unfolded and afterward, it started to feel inappropriate. Since he was asleep, my mind began to wander. I reflected on Op and how he had influenced me to seek someone else. I got up and departed. During the drive home, memories of the first time I was closeness with Op flooded back. We were each other's first and only. I broke down, contemplating how disgusted I was with myself. Then, I found myself angry at Op once more. It truly became a sick cycle. I refused to confront the responsibility of the truly terrible thing I had done. I convinced myself it was his fault. 2 days later, that day began as normal. I went to work, came home, showered, and ate breakfast with my son and sister. My wife called and wanted to make arrangements to see our son. Jenny was cocky and spiteful on the phone. I told her that I would meet her Sunday at 1 p.m. and she could spend some time with him at a local park. She wasn't going for that. She wanted him for the weekend. I said no. She knew him staying at the house solved the babysitting issue for right now. Both her parents worked, so she did not push it, but she did slam the phone down. I went to work at the PD, and the first chance I got, I went to the clerk's office and filed for the divorce. Later in the day, I was notified by a girl I knew there that they were ready to go to the sheriff's office to be served. I called a deputy I knew and told him the story and asked him to serve them to her at work. He said he would. The next day, wife also returned to work. Her janitor came by her station and chatted her up throughout the day. They were not able to eat lunch together that day, nor meet that evening. He claimed he had to go to something with one of his kids. He told my wife earlier in the affair he was divorced and had 3 kids. She went to her parents after work later that night. She called me 3 times, and each time I hung up on her after found out it was her color. ID was not the norm back then in my area. After another long night of grieving, My day started out like the day before. I went to work. After I arrived at my second job, I received a phone call from the deputy that was going to serve the papers. He told me he would get there around noon. I explained that would be fine. Her lunch hour was from 11 a.m. to noon. I sat at my desk and tried to work. I was antsy and got up and went to the restroom at least 3 times until I finally threw up. I calmed myself and kept reminding myself it was the right thing to do. Thankfully, I had not heard from my wife so far. 11 a.m. That day, my wife meets the janitor for lunch. They retire to his car in the parking lot and do it classy. They clean up, go back inside, and grab something in the cafeteria for lunch. At noon, my wife returns to the nurse's station on her hall, along with the janitor, and starts talking to the registered nurse in charge of the hall. 5 minutes later, the deputy walks in. He asks the nurse where he can find Jenny. She speaks up. "Yes, that's me." The deputy turns to her and in a loud voice says, "You are being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My wife falls on the floor. Here are her words describing what happened. Upon hearing that, a profound wave of shame and guilt engulfed me. The realization struck that I had irreparably damaged my marriage and that Op was genuinely proceeding with a divorce. A misguided part of me naively clung to the hope that he wouldn't follow through, deluding myself into thinking it was just another argument I could somehow win. Reflecting on it now, it's sick thinking. I distinctly recall the deputy physically lifting me and placing me in a chair amid screams emanating from me. The head nurse attempted to pacify my escalating distress. In the tumult, my affair partner attempted to grasp my hand, and in my emotional turmoil, I struck him. The punch veered to his neck as he recoiled, leaving a scratch. My vehement outburst accused him of ruining my life. They managed to soothe her. The deputy informed that the janitor promptly left, allowing her to resume her shift. However, a colleague nurse provided significant cover for her. 3 hours later, as Jenny neared the end of her shift, she received a summons to the hospital administrator's office, leaving her frightened, suspecting someone had reported her outburst. Upon arrival, the lady closed the door and promptly delivered the news of her termination, instructing her not to return to the property and that her last check would be sent through the mail. It appeared that someone had witnessed the incident in the parking lot and reported it, triggering subsequent events. The head nurse, informed about the divorce papers, shared the story, leading to the janitor being questioned, fired, and escorted off the property an hour before Jenny's termination. The entire hospital was now aware of the unfolding drama. She mentioned that she just went to the car and drove to her parents. At this point, they still didn't know the full extent of the situation, only that she and I had separated, and it seemed serious. At 5:30 p.m. that day, I was having dinner with my son at home. My sister was out with friends, and we were simply spending time together. The deputy had relayed earlier events, and I took some satisfaction in knowing the consequences. The janitor being there was just blind luck. I was surprised she hadn't been arrested for assaulting him, but hey, you can't have everything. Then, a knock at the door interrupted our evening. Before me stood a lady, about 5'8" tall and enormously pregnant, barely able to stand straight. She asked for Jenny. I explained she no longer lived there and wouldn't be returning. Confirming I was her soon-to-be ex-husband, I informed her that I had served the divorce papers that day. She introduced herself as Wendy, the janitor's wife, pregnant with their 4th child. Despite my reluctance, I let her in to sit down. Wendy disclosed the earlier events, the firing, and the circumstances surrounding it. It made me feel nauseous. Who had I married? She also shared details about the house where my wife met the janitor. At that moment, I wished I could erase him from existence. Not for my wife's sake, but for the sake of humanity. This guy was despicable. Again. More on the house later. After assuring me that she only wanted to talk to Jenny and reveal the truth, Wendy left. 1 hour later, Wendy approached my father-in-law, seeking to speak to my wife, thinking she was a friend of Jenny's. When Jenny appeared, Wendy disclosed her identity and the truth about the janitor. Wendy and the janitor were still married, and she was 8 months pregnant with their 4th child. Jenny was upset, crying, and repeatedly apologizing. However, the revelation took a darker turn. The janitor, along with another hospital colleague and a friend, had been playing a game, scoring how many married women they could seduce within 90 days. Until my wife, the third man, was leading with 3. My wife became the janitor's third conquest. Oh, and on the night he claimed to be with one of his kids, he engaged with the 4th woman. According to Wendy, this 4th lady had been married for 25 years, and Wendy was informing her husband. Then, it was their neighbor. The house served as a place they rented for these encounters with married women. Wendy learned about this 2 hours after his termination. He returned home, intoxicated and tearful, confessing everything in an attempt to reconcile. Wendy left with the kids and informed my wife that she was leaving him. She then squared up her shoulders, slapped my wife hard across the face, and called her a foolish cow. Jenny was stunned. Wendy told her she should be ashamed of tossing away her family, recounting how she had witnessed a loving man feeding his son alone because his wife was a foolish, selfish person without morals. Overwhelmed, my wife lost control, crying, while Wendy walked away, got in the car, and left. My in-laws checked on her. After the car drove off, she was essentially catatonic. They got her inside and considered taking her to the emergency room when she began speaking incoherently. My father-in-law thought she might be on speed. She expressed remorse and a determination to fix things. They eventually calmed her down and learned the whole story. My father-in-law was deeply hurt. He was and is a good man, he later said. Jenny could see the shame and disappointment on his face. As for my mother-in-law, as usual, she blamed me. I'm not fond of her. In the aftermath, my father-in-law called me the next day and apologized, the only time I ever suspected he had tears in his eyes. He shared what had happened and mentioned that Jenny had been in her room all day and night. I informed him about the appointment. She had to meet me on Sunday at 1 at the park. He said okay and hung up. I worked on Friday and attended school on Saturday. By day's end, I learned I had passed and would receive my degree. Bittersweet, but I had made it. My parents celebrated that night with extended family coming over and cooking out. I have a great family. The next day, no one brought up Jenny. At the time, I hadn't heard from her. We were supposed to meet up at 1. I considered it a blessing, something I could use in a custody hearing if needed. At 3:30, her father called. He mentioned Jenny was still not responding coherently, walking around in her bathrobe with a notebook in her hands, not bathing, and eating sparingly. He was worried and tired, afraid to sleep in case she hurt herself. He asked me to come see her, but I declined. I couldn't feel anything for her. I told him to get her some help, and I would allow her to see our son when she could get herself together. I truly felt nothing for her that first night. I had gone through my trial by fire and emerged stronger. More on that later. I wasn't going to care about this person ever again. I didn't hear from her or her family for 2 weeks. 2 weeks elapsed since I last spoke with my father-in-law. During that time, I quit my part-time job and actively sought a new one. I had plans to pursue my MBA, but wanted to settle into a new job for a year or 2. My son was asking about his mother, and I could only comfort him at that point. The longer she went without reaching out to see him, the better for my chances of securing a good custody deal. I was at the PD when she called, asking to set up a time to meet and see our son. I inquired if she had pulled herself together enough not to scare him, and she replied affirmatively. I told her I would meet her at 9 a.m. at the park on Saturday and asked her to bring her dad. I didn't want to meet her alone. My mother went with me. Upon seeing her, I knew I had made the right decision to limit her contact to only 2 hours. She was a mess, significant weight loss, no makeup, and lacking the feminine smells I associated with her. I later learned her mother had bathed and dressed her. Jenny was not fully functional yet. Park meetings continued for approximately 3 weeks, and I extended them to 4 hours, including Sundays. While she appeared to improve each week, I remained concerned about her mental health, leading me to avoid letting our son stay with her overnight or see him alone. Eventually, my mother-in-law grew tired of this and hired an attorney to sue for custody. At this point, Jenny had not yet signed the divorce papers, but I was okay with that, since I could petition for a divorce in 6 months. However, the custody suit angered me, because she sought full custody. Despite my prior willingness, conveyed to her father, to eventually work towards 50-50 custody, her mother dismissed this and demanded full custody. In response, I requested full custody on the grounds of mental defect. I was ready for a legal battle, needing an outlet for my anger. This was it. On the day of the custody hearing, my lawyer informed me that her attorney had a request. Jenny wanted to speak with me privately. Initially, I declined, but they proposed doing so in the hallway outside the courtroom, visible to both attorneys, yet with inaudible conversation. I reluctantly agreed. During our private conversation, she engaged in small talk, inquiring about our son's well-being and my school. I informed her that I had passed and graduation was next week, making her happy. When she asked to attend my graduation, I declined, stating that it was for family and friends, and she was neither. This deeply hurt her, particularly since we had worked together for most of our time to achieve this goal. I further rejected her by emphasizing, "It's special to me. It didn't matter enough to you when you let someone use you like trash." My behavior became increasingly hostile as I wanted to inflict pain. She teared up, returned to her attorney, and the hearing commenced. During the hearing, I testified without any unusual revelations. However, my mother-in-law placed all the blame on me, accusing me of seeing someone, which allegedly drove my wife crazy. Although there was no proof of this, she cared little for the truth. She also claimed I had assaulted my wife by grabbing her and throwing her on the hood of the car on the night she left. Then it was Jenny's turn. While answering questions from her lawyer, she abruptly stopped and asked the judge if she could speak. Advised to confer with her attorney, she declined and proceeded. Here are my wife's words from her notebook. "I remember how sad I was. After the hearing started, I listened to Op give his side of the story and how he had taken care of our boy all these weeks. I needed to make this right. I sat there listening to Mama, and I knew she was lying to protect me. But it was just another lie on top of a lie. I had enough. I had to fix this." Jenny then expressed her desire to apologize to my parents and her own parents. Looking at me, she acknowledged that I probably hated her more than anyone in the world at that moment. She accepted full responsibility for everything, hoping to salvage anything left of our relationship, even if it only meant that I could look at her without disgust. She informed the judge of her decision to withdraw her custody claim and would adhere to any custody arrangement I saw fit to give her. I conferred with my attorney, and we offered supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, with our son staying with her every other weekend. After that, if no issues arose, we adjourned. Looking back, I think that is when I saw a small ray of possibility. We would be nicer to each other. Not reconcile, but at least cordial. The schedule worked well, and after the 3rd week, we began spending visitation time with just her, me, and our son, usually extending to 3 or 4 hours. Although I wasn't friendly, I genuinely enjoyed watching my son play with his mother, benefiting them both. The only negative incident occurred during the 5th visit when she hugged my right arm from behind while I was watching our son play. I freaked out, yelled at her never to touch me again. The next week, we acted as though nothing happened, and she kept her distance. 1 more month passed, and our discussions increasingly centered on day-to-day matters. I landed a new job with a higher salary, and she commenced nursing school. She started sharing with me that the janitor persistently called her and refused to leave her alone. Wanting to be transparent, she informed me in case I heard that she had asked him to back off. However, he still appeared at her parents' house one night, prompting her father-in-law to threaten intervention if he persisted. Indifferent to her romantic involvement, I expressed that I no longer cared about whom she slept with. She assured me she was not involved with anyone and wouldn't be until she was certain that our family could not be reunited, an outcome I asserted was unlikely. 6 months after our separation, I broached the topic of her signing the divorce papers, to which she refused, reminding her that her signature was unnecessary, but would streamline the process. She proposed a meeting that night at our house for a discussion. If I still desired a divorce, she agreed to sign the papers that night. I consented, and she arrived with small black composition notebooks resembling bound books. She explained that she began jotting down thoughts the day after receiving the divorce papers, unsure why, but finding it helpful. Detailing everything she could recall about the events in as much detail as possible, she wanted me to read it, cautioning that it would be emotionally challenging. Despite my reluctance, she insisted, acknowledging the risk, but feeling compelled to help me understand why she was attempting to salvage our marriage. Reluctantly, I read it. It proved to be a difficult experience, as the closeness details were not explicitly described but alluded to in general terms. What she said about me and our marriage to the janitor, however, was deeply impactful. The book chronicled her mental breakdown, initially presented in a jumble and unorganized manner, but gradually improving each day. She began to analyze her actions, deeming it her therapy. One passage described an irrational conclusion she reached, believing it would rectify everything. According to her, she remembered she never climaxed with the janitor, concluding that if she didn't, it meant she did not enjoy it. Therefore, she believed she had done nothing wrong and I should take her back. This belief persisted until she discussed it with her dad, who uncomfortably clarified that it didn't work that way. Although reading the book didn't change my decision, it instilled a sense of fear in me. I remained concerned about her mental state until I read the content and the way she wrote. Unaware of how fragile her mind had become during those 2 weeks, I agreed to give it more time. This emboldened her to encourage me to write to her, to sit down and compose a letter or something about what had happened. She believed it would provide her with a better understanding of how to assist me. Acknowledging my own emotional turmoil, I considered that it might help me move on and potentially lead to a healthier relationship down the road. What I referred to as her writing therapy evolved into scheduled meetings twice a week. Our initial assignment was to document our perception of the state of our marriage before D-Day. During these meetings, we exchanged letters, made notes, and posed questions in writing. The rules were straightforward: answer honestly, no yelling, and no refusal to answer any question. We commenced with an analysis of our pre-D-Day marriage, progressing through each subsequent day until the Sunday I spoke with her father after she received the divorce papers. After that, we would reassess and proceed accordingly. I must admit, I behaved terribly during this period. While I answered questions honestly, there was one exception, which I'll address later. I used the opportunity to humiliate her, making her repeatedly recount the negative things she said to the janitor about me. I compelled her to provide excruciating details about their carnal encounters. Despite being relatively vanilla compared to our previous experiences together, it was genuinely hurtful. Initially, I believed I could handle it since I had no interest in reconciliation. However, hearing those details was tough. Looking back, it's astonishing how cruel I had become, but in my mind, it was justified at the time. After about a month of this process, I had to acknowledge that it helped me to some extent. She proposed moving back in and taking the next step, but I refused. Despite her pleading and a compelling argument, I stood my ground. I explained that even if I entertained the idea of reconciliation, I couldn't be closeness with her again. She accepted this condition, suggesting I could explore outside the marriage while she remained faithful. That wasn't my character, so I declined. After another month, I relented, but imposed strict rules. These rules were non-negotiable and firmly established. First, she had to sleep in the spare room. Second, absolutely no physical contact was allowed. Third, she could keep her money in her checking account, but I managed her banking and provided checks for her bills, rent for the room, expenses, and spending money. This was due to her giving the janitor $300 from our savings account a week before D-Day. Moreover, I anticipated that she might decline to move in. Fourth, her mother was not permitted to enter my home until we decided to reconcile, as I was still upset with her. Fifth, all prior custody agreements would automatically be reinstated if reconciliation didn't happen. Sixth, if I found someone else, she had 1 week to move out. She agreed to these terms and moved in. It proved to be more challenging than I anticipated, as I no longer had the cooling down period between the times I saw her. She was there all the time, leading to frequent small fights and hurtful remarks from me. I wanted her out. Shortly after she moved back in, we initiated Thursday night fight night, a concept stemming from our writing sessions. Every Thursday night after the kid was asleep, we would discuss ongoing issues or arguments in the living room. These matters had to be resolved before bedtime and could not linger. This practice persists in a modified form today, simply involving a dinner check-in about any issues to address that night. The kids remained unaware of its origin or purpose. I continued to be difficult, bringing up her affair at every opportunity. She handled it with composure, never engaging in the conflict. At that point, I would acknowledge I was emotionally cruel to her. Nevertheless, she remained resilient. recognizing that we were meant to be together. Since she played a part in destroying our lives, she was committed to rebuilding them independently until I could see what she saw and join her. She was willing to give me the time I needed. 6 months after she moved back in, I experienced my own breakthrough. After a particularly challenging day filled with triggers, I locked myself in the bedroom, unable to endure it any longer. My wife came to the door, knocked, and softly said, "You need to talk. I'll be out here when you think you can." I heard her slide down the door, sit on the floor, and lean her back against the door. For an hour she patiently waited, and it was almost midnight when I finally opened the door. She inquired if she could enter, and I declined, suggesting we go to her room. Once in her room, she sat on the bed, and I settled into a chair. It was then that I finally revealed what occurred after I asked her to leave the night I discovered the affair. Following her departure, I spent significant time in my son's room, silently watching him sleep. I retrieved the checkbook, bill ledger, and a copy of the life insurance policy from my desk, placing them conspicuously on the kitchen table. After a shower, I retrieved my .38 from the closet shelf, laid it on the bed, dressed, combed my hair, and sat on the bed, grappling with the taste of oil on the barrel. I distinctly recall becoming fixated on that taste, identical to the scent. The duration of my contemplation remains unclear. Subsequently, I unloaded the weapon, returned it, changed clothes, and went to bed. Regrettably, I believe such thoughts enter the minds of many betrayed spouses. I admitted to her that it was the only detail I had concealed during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed her to hug and kiss me on the forehead in a non-goodbye context. It marked the initial emotional touch I permitted her to have with me. Although I claimed to forgive her that night, I did not genuinely mean it until several months later. Nonetheless, uttering the words began to open the door for me. Following that, physical touch gradually increased, holding hands, farewell kisses, hugs, and so forth. These interactions became more commonplace in our relationship. While full togetherness did not occur, we were progressing in that direction. Eventually, almost a year after her return, we became close. This period seemed like our hysterical bonding phase. She continued journaling, and according to her, we were closeness 32 times in 28 days. Years later, during a conversation, she revealed that until the night we became closeness, she woke up every morning thinking it might be our last day together. She kept telling herself to endure just one more day. Recognizing these signs, she understood that I was reestablishing a connection. Today, we enjoy a strong marriage, both successful in our careers, with 3 grown children. As far as we know, they are unaware of these past events. There are no plans to disclose, but we won't lie if they inquire. Both of us underwent significant changes. My wife emerged stronger and wiser, viewing this period as an unnecessary evil she caused but successfully overcame. Sometimes, I believe she still imposes punishment on herself. As for me, this topic seldom surfaces in our discussions or arguments, not for over 20 years. She is perceptive and often recognizes when I experience a trigger. Though infrequent, they still occur, perhaps once or twice a year. While brief, they sting. Typically, she grabs my hand and holds it or hugs me, saying, "I love you," or simply expressing gratitude. I lost some positive aspects of myself. I tend to withhold my feelings, dealing with them privately while supporting her emotional needs. I've made it clear that I won't be her emotional crutch anymore. It is now her responsibility to communicate the issue and propose a plan for resolution, which I will assist in implementing. I love her, and I had to learn to love her again. It's different, more realistic, but intense nonetheless. As mentioned earlier, I believe I had to sacrifice a part of my goodness for her to grow into a better person. At this juncture in my life, I am content with that choice. I share this in the hope that it may benefit someone. While every situation is unique, this approach proved effective for us, and I'm grateful for that. I'm not advocating for reconciliation. I'm advocating for self-control. Focus on what you can change, not what you can't. Prioritize what benefits you in your specific circumstances. Be self-centered to some extent, then consider rebuilding a collective we in a marriage or relationship later. Look up the Serenity Prayer on Google. In my opinion, no truer words have ever been written. Remember, You're hearing about the worst days of our lives and marriage during the process of surviving infidelity. Despite this tragedy, we've created many greater, happier memories that far outweigh it. I wish you all the best on this journey. With effort focused on yourself, you can emerge victorious on the other side of the pain. Update. I want to inform everyone that we are still married. Now we have grandchildren, and if you're aware, you know it's an entirely different kind of love. My wife is semi-retired, working as PRN, meaning as needed or when she wants to. I continue working full-time, but we managed to find ample time for travel. I can't recall the last time I had a trigger, perhaps about 3 years ago, and only because our oldest discovered about my wife's affair through a vindictive relative leading a very lonely life. My wife handled it with grace and humility, and it impacted me in a way that I finally moved on completely. She apologized for the pain she caused, and we both emphasized that it was in the past. Any issues he had, we offered help, but cautioned him that ultimately it was between us, falling under matters that were our business. Fortunately, it hasn't seemed to affect their relationship, even though she was understandably embarrassed. Update. 3 weeks ago, my wife Jenny passed away after a 6-month battle with colon cancer. She left us with all of us by her bedside in the home we constructed 4 years ago for our retirement. Her retirement, only 18 months in when she was diagnosed, was abruptly cut short. Describing the loss is beyond my capacity. It surpasses any pain I've encountered, even the collective anguish experienced in this community as betrayed loved ones. Following our reconciliation, she spent the remaining years making amends for the pain she caused, and she succeeded in a remarkable manner. I feel her absence deeply, as do our children. However, I recognize that I am still here for a purpose. In her final days, Jenny wrote a letter to me. She entrusted our pastor to deliver it after the ceremony at the appropriate moment. I read the letter 3 days ago, and I'd like to share a passage from it. For those of you who have read our story and found something positive, it underscores the importance for betrayed individuals to forgive. It also highlights that those who betray and genuinely feel remorse should endure long-term consequences for their actions. Here is the passage. I am currently experiencing a considerable amount of physical pain, as you are aware, but my faith provides me with a perspective on what lies ahead. The pain will eventually diminish. Certain pains have a tendency to turn one inward, and I've been introspective in recent weeks. At times I believe I deserve this pain due to what I did to you, to us, many years ago. However, you consistently lift me, settle me in my chair, assist me with meals, bathe me, hold my hand, and play your guitar. As I immerse myself in memories, I recognize that this pain is a gift. It allows me to encounter the true essence of love in its purest form, your genuine forgiveness for my past actions. Your actions caring for me reflect true love and forgiveness. I love you immensely. There is more to say, but I wanted to share this with our community and express gratitude for your presence in our lives, even if it's on the periphery. I love you as well.